This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I am Gilad Halpern.
And I'm Dahlia Shenlin.
If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. All you have to do is go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, scroll down to the bottom, and click the big red button that says Patreon. We are counting on you. Every week, Dahlia and I bring you interviews with authors of books and research and other things that we find interesting. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany is now holding the EU presidency for the second half of 2020. And as our listeners know, the Tel Aviv Review is holding a special series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries with their generous support.
And today we return to the topic of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and we are very happy to welcome Dr. Anders Persson. He is a senior lecturer at Linnaeus University's Department of Political Science. In the past, he's been a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Copenhagen and at Lund University. We will be talking about his new book, fresh off the press, entitled EU Diplomacy and the Israeli-Arab Conflict 1967 to 2019, published by Edinburgh University Press in August of 2020. This is his fourth book addressing related topics, so he's really the expert in the EU role on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Anders Persson is speaking to us from his home outside Malmo in Sweden. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Great. Let's start at the beginning. I think the most important or interesting thing about the book is just to observe exactly how obsessed, we might say, the EU is with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And I think you make the argument that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is among the most prominent foreign policy issues for the EU.
Even so much as to say the centerpiece.
Maybe the centerpiece.
Yes.
How would you characterize it? How important is it exactly to the EU?
Well, I mean, I look at a sort of 50-year period since 1967. I started in January 1967, and I have gone through a huge archive material called the EU or the EC Bulletin, and then the EU Bulletin. So I've gone through 80,000 pages of EU text.
Because so that we don't have to.
No, exactly. Searching for keywords of Israel, Palestine, Arab, Middle East, these kind of keywords. And out of that, I got around 2,300 sort of different statements on this conflict. And then I went in to sort of analyze them more on a qualitative basis. So, and out of these, all of these statements, I sort of construct a thesis that the Israeli-Arab conflict has been more important for the EU than other conflicts. And that's because of four reasons. And the first is that the conflict has been central to the formation of the EU's foreign policy. And then the conflict has had a persistent, unique place in the EU's foreign policy. And number three, the EU's involvement in the conflict has been based on major strategic factors like security, oil, and trade. And number four, the EU is part of the conflict. So these are sort of the four key arguments underlying the overall thesis that this conflict has been particularly important.
Well, I find those arguments for why it's important to be very convincing, but I just want to press you on one sort of nerdy data point, because as a quantitative researcher, do we know that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is really more important than every other foreign policy area, or specifically conflict? I mean, if we measure, for example, India and Pakistan and Kashmir, do we know that there are, 5 times more mentions of Israel-Palestine, for example?
Yeah, well, the thing, I haven't coded other conflicts, but I mean, it's so clear in the material that I look at that, I mean, it's extremely difficult to name, the conflict number 2, that has gotten the second most attention. I guess it will probably be the Bosnian War in the 1990s. But the thing here is that most conflicts, they tend to end somehow. And Israel-Palestine is, of course, an exception of a conflict that hasn't ended. India-Pakistan is another of these conflicts, but it's too far away from the EU. So the EU has not been that involved in that.
But the more interesting thing, I think, in your work and, just looking at the subject altogether is the earlier years. Because, to what extent, I'm wondering, was it a phenomenon that accompanied the formation of the EU as a political entity and therefore, the formation of its foreign policy, because it did start as an economic union and then gradually evolved into something that had more political impact. To what extent was, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict something that was just there for them to, latch onto in a way when they were formulating their, the fact that the EU has foreign policy in the first place?
Well, I think we need to go back to, say, the late 1960s here. During the late 1960s, there was a lot of talk in the European Parliament. This was before, the EU had a foreign policy. There was a lot of talk of that the EU should have a foreign policy and that the EU should unite and become a real actor. And in the middle of all this, we had the 1967 war, a big war happening close to Europe at a time when 80% of the EU's oil consumption came from the Middle East, a big part of the EU's overall energy. So these kind of factors, both these identity aspects and the strategic factors, they came together and open up what I call a marvelous opportunity for the EU. And that's actually a quote from a European parliamentarian who said that this is a marvelous opportunity for the EU, both to unite around this major issue and also to help the conflict, help resolving the conflict, because this was 20 years after the Second World War, and the feeling among many in the European Parliament was that if we in the EU could overcome our differences, then it should be no problem for the people of the Middle East to do the same, and we can help them in doing that.
I think this is going to lead to a very interesting conversation about the evolution of the EU's positioning on foreign policy. But before we do that, I just want to ask one more question about, as far as the EU was concerned, was 1967 that first so-called marvelous opportunity? I'm, being a little cynical here because, of course, it's not a marvelous anything. But did the EU have anything to say about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict before 1967? Or, as you point out, it just was too busy kind of coming into existence and hadn't really even considered foreign policy yet?
Yeah, I actually start my analysis in January 1967. I don't go back to earlier issues of this archive material because I had 80,000 pages to cover, so that was more than enough. So I actually haven't looked at the data before that. I guess it wouldn't have too much to say. There are a few trade agreements and stuff like that signed with Israel, but the focus was very much agricultural policy and these kind of things. Before the late 1960s. So this is actually the time when the EU is sort of starting off its foreign policy. And right from the beginning, this conflict is there as a very central place.
Yeah, I have to say that it took me by surprise that it was such, as I said earlier, the centerpiece of the EU foreign policy, because we tend to forget now, in 2020, that up until 30 years ago, the biggest geostrategic issue in the world was the Cold War, and that also had implications for the conflict in the Middle East. Of course, we do know that the Arab-Israeli divide was equally divided along the Cold War divisions. And of course, the EU had a lot to say about the Cold War because they were on the rims of the Soviet bloc. Where does that? How does that feed into that realization that the EU was so, as Dalia said, obsessed with the Middle East conflict? How do you analyze it against the backdrop of the Cold War?
I think it fits perfectly into sort of the whole Cold War narrative. Keep in mind that this happens in the period of détente, where there is, better relations between the two superpowers, the US and the Soviet Union, and also more space for others to act. So that sort of gives the EU a certain possibility of start raising its voice here. Now that gets more difficult when a new period of the Cold War escalates in the late 1970s, what is called the Reagan's new Cold War. Then the sort of the space for EU diplomacy gets smaller again. But pretty much the whole 1970s was the period of détente, and that meant opportunities for other actors on the world stage, and EU was one of them.
The 1970s was also a period in which the EU or at that time, the European community did what you call a departure, because one of the most fascinating bits of information that you clarified through your research is that in 1967, at the end of the war, the EU foreign ministers actually said nothing about Israel conquering territories. But all of a sudden, after 1973, they made a much stronger statement against Israel having acquired territories. Can you tell us about that shift, and what was it related to, and what did it have to do with that period?
Well, as I said, the EU had an enormous oil dependency on the countries of the Middle East. In 1967, it was 80% of its oil consumption, 48% of its total supply of power came from the countries of the Middle East. Now, keep in mind, it was a much smaller EU than we have today, but we're talking about West Europe, basically, but still. And then, of course, we had another shock in 1973 when prices went up fourfold, in a very short period of time. And that, of course, expressed, the enormous dependencies that the EU had at the time on the countries of the Middle East. And the high oil prices led to massive transferring of wealth from the industrialized world, EU, US, Japan, to the countries of the Middle East, which in turn leads to a massive increase in trade. So trade between the EU and the OPEC countries goes up 1,000% in the 1970s, creating another strategic objective. So this is sort of the background to what I call the EU's declaratory diplomacy, which started
Or you could also call it a sudden and coincidental normative shift in perspective about things like the ideals of international relations.
Yes. So in practice, what happens here is that the EU takes the Arab and later Palestinian narrative of the conflict into much greater account. So first, the EU starts talking about the Palestinians only as refugees, and with no criticism of Israel. And after the war in 1973 and the oil crisis, this changed very fast. The EU started talking about Palestinians, but just using the term Palestinians, it was very sensitive at the time, talking about the Palestinians as a people with legal rights, with a right to a homeland, with a right to self-determination, and the EU advocated for talks with the PLO. All of these things happened in the 1970s. It looked pretty much like, the discussion on Zionism, 80 years earlier. So and this had major consequences.
But what does this say about the kind of reigning, important paradigms of international affairs? I mean, are we looking at a competition between a realist perspective on this that is purely interest-driven, by economic and trade relations and security considerations, et cetera? Or is there an idealist paradigm, or are they actually in dialogue with one another? In that interest drive changes of ideology, and then the ideological aspect becomes genuine?
I would say both. I mean, there is absolutely sort of a real political base to this evolvement of the EU's policies, meaning, that's, security, resources, trade, oil dependencies. These are all realism features. And beside that, you have the whole liberal discourse of international law, the UN system, democracy promotion, self-determination, and all of that. And I would also add a third constructivist perspective, emphasizing, normative power, discourses, agency, identification, all of that. So all of these sort of three main paradigms of international relations, they are at play here.
Again, we have to bear in mind that these developments, of course, did not happen in a vacuum, and they were in tandem with similar developments. The PLO becoming global actor, and thinking about Yasser Arafat being invited to speak at the UN, and of course the Zionism is racism resolution in the UN as well. I mean, if you can elaborate quickly on how it came to play with the broader diplomatic scenery, and also bearing in mind that at the end of the 1970s, of course, comes the Venice Declaration in 1980, which is in many ways paving the way to what the international community's stance on the Israeli-Palestinian issue has been ever since.
Well, I mean, beside all of these, and I think it's fair to say pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian developments, there is, besides this, the EU has always believed that Israel's existence has been sacrosanct. And the EU came out very strongly against the UN's resolution that Zionism is racism. And we can see this kind of pattern emerging today as well when it comes to BDS and anti-Zionism and these kind of things. So the support for Israel has always been there, I would say. But this development of taking Palestinian and Arab considerations into more account has been very important because the argument that I make and others make is that this normative power of the EU has influenced most of all the American position. It influenced, for example, Carter's position, and the positions that Carter took pretty much looked like these positions that the EU had outlined before. And I think this normative diplomacy is even more powerful when we go into the next period of the Oslo and Madrid peace processes, where you can see that during the 1980s that the EU was very, very strongly legitimizing the two key concepts of Oslo, and that was mutual recognition and the land for peace formula.
But can you say a few words about the emergence of the Venice Declaration?
Oh, no,
not yet.
More than a few words.
Yeah.
We want
because
lots
it
of
is.
words on this.
It is. I
want to focus the question a little bit, because I think we were both kind of interested in this period of the Venice Declaration in 1980, which probably a lot of our listeners don't really know because even we barely thought about it. And then also you spent a little time talking about the Fez, the Saudi proposal, which I have to confess was not on my radar at all. And they both happened around the same time. And I'm not raising this just to be wonky and esoteric. I think that it says something interesting about the dynamics at play long before the era that we consider the two-state paradigm or the partition paradigm that emerged with Oslo.
Yeah, I mean, all of this diplomacy and the rhetoric, because it was rhetoric, it's important to emphasize this is only rhetoric. All of this rhetoric during the 1970s culminated with the Venice Declaration, another declaration, but still considered the most important EU declaration on the Israeli-Arab conflict. And
I'm just going to stop you for a second. Make sure to tell us what it is, because a lot of us don't know.
It came in 1980, and it consisted of 11 articles, of which the two most important were that the EU, it was called the EC back then, but the EU advocated Palestinian self-determination and talks with the PLO. That was sort of the two most important declarations. And then you had support for 242 and all of that, and Israel's right to exist and these kind of things. But the two new policy departures were that the EU supported Palestinian self-determination and talks with the PLO, which were, of course, very radical positions back then.
And tell us also about the Fez proposal.
Yeah, and around this time there was the Saudi plan, they called the Fez, King Saud plan, also called the Fez plan, and the Reagan plan, and these plans sort of advocated similar things, but they came after the EU's plan. They came in 1982 after the first Lebanon war. And I should also say that the Venice Declaration came at the time when there was a lot of optimism here. It was right after Camp David and the Israeli-Egyptian peace treaty. So the EU believed that it would sort of stake out a new position and assume a much bigger role in the conflict. And instead of that, a lot of trouble happened. Things that were not related to them. I mean, we had the momentous year of 1979, the Iranian Revolution, the invasion of Afghanistan, and many of these things contributed to tightening the Cold War and to lead the Cold War into a new period, which gave much less room for maneuver for the EU. And then, of course, we had a very, very big thing with the first Lebanon war and the Israeli invasion of Lebanon in 1982.
Sure, but I think the question that they raised in my mind, these two developments, were that even before the Lebanon war, the first thing that happened was that Israel roundly, repeatedly, angrily, and publicly rejected both of them. This kind of raised the question in my mind of how accurate it is to generally portray the Palestinians as rejectionists all the time. It's a very common theme in Western understandings of the conflict. And here we see, this breakthrough, at least rhetorical statement. And the first thing that Israel does is absolutely reject them. Do you think that this indicates some sort of a misunderstanding of the dynamics of the conflict, or am I wrong? And you can say, well, they weren't serious anyway.
No, I think, there is a pattern here that Israel is almost always opposed to all EU declarations on the conflict, except for those that deal with Hamas and some other things. But the truth, of course, is, and you see this very clearly in the data, is that Israel itself has taken on not all, but most of these positions themselves. I mean, that is using the word Palestinians, seeing the Palestinians as a people, being in favor of some kind of Palestinian self-determination and later a state. So many of these policy departures that the EU was among the first to outline has been adopted, and not just by the international community, by actors like the US, but even by the governments of Israel and the PA as well.
And what's the lag time? So you're saying the EU says stuff, or the European community, and then Israel comes around to it later. Are we talking about 2 years later or 20 years later?
Yeah, but a couple of years, I would say. I mean, it depends a little. I mean, 5 years, say a lot of the things that the EU said in the 1970s more or less materialized in the 1980s. A lot of the things that the EU said in the 1980s materialized with the peace process in the 1990s. So these are sort of the time frames, I would say. And of course, some of the things the EU has been in favor of has not happened. We haven't seen a Palestinian state yet, for example.
Did it encourage the European decision makers? The fact that there were in many ways pioneers in the diplomacy of the Middle East conflict?
I don't know about that, to be honest. I mean, most European politicians who are dealing with this conflict today have no clue about these developments that went on in the 70s and the 80s. But it's important also here to say that the EU, even today, with all its troubles and problems, and we have heard about them in several of your previous episodes, the EU is still the largest bloc of liberal democracies in the world. And that gives it enormous normative power. And Israel is very, very conscious about that. We see that, for example, when it comes to the votes in the UN, in the Security Council, and in the General Assembly about recognizing Palestine and these kind of things. Europeans are extremely important there. We saw it, of course, with the reaction against the Swedish recognition of Palestine too.
Right. I'd like to ask you said about the empirical basis of your work. You said you went through tens of thousands of pages of material, and as you also write, you rely heavily and mostly on the Bulletin of the European Communities and later the Bulletin of the European Union. Can you tell us what they are? Is it like protocols? I mean, what was it? Can you describe the empirical basis of your work?
Yeah. It's a key EU publication that came out on a monthly basis, sometimes with one double issue every year. So every month the bulletin came out with 200 pages outlining the main, the main things that were going on in the different EU institutions, say the main, foreign affairs resolutions, the main things going on in the commissions with, trade agreements and these kind of things, the main things that went on in the European Parliament. So it's a good sort of archive material to use, not just on this conflict, but on many other EU policies as well. So I looked at that material for my latest book.
And again comes the question that we discussed a bit earlier about, the conflict of authority within the European Union, between the central union and the individual member states when it comes to, political power, but also foreign policy. How did it, looking at the EU foreign policy, doesn't it tell a partial picture without taking into account the decisions, the executive decisions of each sovereign government?
Something that Netanyahu has been very effective at leveraging.
Yeah. But that's absolutely a valid criticism, a point of criticism against my work. On the other hand, I would sort of defend
myself. Except that you write about it in your work.
But I would defend myself by saying that I actually look at sort of the final product, the final resolutions, the final, agreements, and these are sort of the products after the disagreements. So that's what I look at. And of course, they are there in the background all the time. And you can, of course, write, another story of all the kind of troubles that accompany EU policies, especially in this conflict with all the different, voices and the bilateral, relations that all countries have with both Israel and the Palestinians. But I think that's sort of a separate story. I look at the actual policies. What have they done? What have they said, with all these, constraints in the background?
I think one of the interesting underlying themes here, and you alluded to it before, is Israel's sort of complicated relationship with the EU. And as you said, many times Israel's initial reaction would be to reject EU statements. We know that they've had their disagreements. I want to ask about one of a kind of a finding that was a little bit buried maybe, but I noticed it in the book, in which you pointed out that the EU did not very frequently, certainly in those early years, condemn terrorism. At one point, you mention a rare condemnation after terror attacks in European airports. Do you think there's an underlying suspicion by Israel of the EU because of that? Or what are the, why was there not such significant notice of terrorism at that time?
So, just to give sort of the background story here is that, the worst terror attacks against Israel took place in the 1970s, the Malot school massacre, the Coastal Road attack, and some others. And there were no condemnations at all.
How could that be?
That's a good question. And I don't have the answer to it because I haven't been able to interview those people that were around when these decisions were taken. But from a pure sort of, if I have to speculate about it, I think that these terror attacks carried out by nationalist groups had greater legitimacy than the attacks carried on later on by militant Islamists. There could also be, say, a third world, freedom fighter perspective attached to it. So I don't have the answer to it, but it is very interesting. And I think that these could be some of the dynamics that could be at play here.
But also maybe zooming out on Dalia's question a bit, broadening it, there's an almost underlying consensus among Israelis. It's a very simplistic one that the EU is pro-Arab, whereas the US is more pro-Israeli. Do you think that, having studied it so thoroughly, is there any truth in that?
Yes, there's a lot of truth in that. I think, there is very few people would question that. Say the US has been pro-Israeli over the past 50
I'm talking
years.
about the EU.
True, but you do make the case that I think in the book you make the case that the EU was trying hard at various points as part of its policy to keep both sides in its good graces for different reasons.
No, but there is no, especially in the material that I have looked at from the 1970s and the 80s, there are no doubts that the EU took a pro-Arab and later pro-Palestinian positions, and that many of these declarations were anathema to the official positions of various Israeli governments. So there is no doubt in that there is sort of were a pro-Arab, pro-Palestinian basis to these early foreign policy declarations. But I would argue that the data very clearly shows that this has changed over the decades. And another major conclusion that I have in my book is that for the past 2 decades or so, the EU has been much less critical of Israel than what many people believe, and much more critical of the Palestinians.
Can you give us some examples?
Yes, take a look at the EU statements on all the wars that Israel have been involved in from the Second Lebanon War of 2006. Very little criticism against Israel. The same is true for the 3 Gaza wars of the 2008, 9, 12, and 14. So you see very, very little criticism there. Instead, you see more and more criticism of the Palestinians and other actors, Hamas and Hezbollah, especially over their terrorist attacks and rocket fire.
Why do you think that is?
I think that after the 9/11 attacks in the U.S., a very, very strong, shall we call it, war on terrorism narrative took over, took hold, even in the EU, even if that is not something that many people believe. And also the fact that the EU was part of various mechanisms like the Quartet also gave the EU less independent room for maneuver, and also meant that the EU had to more closely align its positions with the US. And also, I think there is an idea. I think, keep in mind that the EU's vision of a two-state solution is based on a strong Palestinian Authority and not a weak Palestinian Authority. So there is very little support for political or militant Islamism within the EU.
Well, this brings me to what might be our wrap-up topic or wrap-up question, which is, you have a chapter examining the EU's commitment to what you call the sacred flame of the two-state solution. What is the significance of the two-state solution now? I mean, given the long years of failure to reach one, and the shakeup of the Trump administration, should the EU continue keeping it as a sacred flame?
That's a good question. I mean, in many ways, the EU looks pretty much like the Palestinian Authority at the moment. It's weak, it's divided, it has no clear...
I think that's quite flattering. It's a quite flattering comparison.
I say it with a heavy heart, but it's weak, it's divided, it has a hard time, formulating a strategy for the future. It's only reacting to events. But I mean, on the other hand, and this is something that I often challenge my Israeli friends back when they press me on these kind of issues. I mean, feel free to formulate, a better vision for solving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
I don't think you want to go down that road with me.
No. But I mean, the thing is, we see now an alternative vision, formulated by Trump, and that they are trying to implement now. So that is an alternative vision. So that's and the EU has big problems right now with a lot of things concerning this conflict. For example, for many years, as I said, for decades, the EU led this conflict when it comes to new terminology, to policy departures, and this has basically stopped. And the EU is stuck here in the vision of a two-state solution, which is getting increasingly difficult to realize, maybe impossible, difficult to say, So there is a lot of soul searching going on in the EU at the moment, but sort of without finding a way forward.
And maybe refusal to admit failure?
Well, I think that, if you speak with EU officials, they are, very honest in that these 50 years have not, have been very problematic to express it mildly. But genuinely, I think EU officials, they do believe in a two-state solution, and that they do not at all believe in other solutions. So that makes them sort of stuck in a kind of strange situation, that you believe in something that is perhaps not realizable, and you cannot really find any alternatives.
Okay, so let's try to sum it up. Do you think that the only two options out there are the Trump vision, which you can kind of characterize as cutting up Palestinian territory and having, one state of Israel, which controls as a state most of the territory between the river and the sea and a few bubbles of autonomy, or the old two-state solution, which doesn't seem to be working out? Are those the only two options that you can imagine, or do you think the EU should take a more forward-looking approach and come up with some alternative?
Now, I think there are a lot of gray spaces or gray areas in between, say, there are many different versions of a one-state solution to begin with, from everything to say from continued occupation to the Palestinian version of a one-state solution. And there are many different versions of a two-state solution as well, from the EU's vision to the Trump vision, for example. So there are there is a lot of gray areas concerning both of these visions. And of course, there are other visions like confederations and these kind of things. But the EU has a very difficult time of just bringing up alternatives and just discuss them on a sort of more intellectual basis.
Okay, Anders Persson, when you are the president of the EU, of the Council of the EU, you'll make these decisions, and I'm sure you'll do a great job. Thank you for being on the show. We've been discussing your book, EU Diplomacy and the Israeli-Arab Conflict from 1967 to 2019. Thank you again for speaking with us.
Thanks for having me.
And thanks to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like you to please consider writing us a review. Go to the ratings and review section and just express yourself there. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. We have about 600 interviews for you. If you like us, you can like us also on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter, and join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.